Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to the Writers on Film podcast. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a film critic and writer, and today I'm going to be talking to Glenn Frankel. Glenn was a journalist for the Washington Post for many years before turning his hand to writing some of the best film books of the last few years. He has written books on The Searchers, High Noon, and most recently Midnight Cowboy. We'll be discussing all of the books. If you enjoy the conversation, please remember to like and spread the word as far and wide as you can. You can follow me on Twitter at drjonty, DRJONTY, but before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. My prevailing fear that I shall one of these days do an interview and then have nothing to show for it.
I know the feeling, John. It's even happened once or twice to me, not with Zoom, but in other parts of my life. So yes, make sure you're good.
You started off as a journalist kind of in another part of the world. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was a journalist for more than 30 years, 27 of them at the Washington Post. So I wrote 2 books during that time, but the movie book writing gig really began when the journalism gig finally ended.
Was it always your passion as well? Did you have it as a sort of hobby, watching movies and everything, or was it something you got into later?
Oh, I watch movies. I mean, I'm from a generation where movies were the seminal, landmark, all-encompassing cultural item. I mean, I guess music to an extent, but really, movies really dominated our lives in a way. Every new movie that came out that, was at all interesting, I went to see I'm talking about when I'm 20, 21. I went to Columbia University in New York. And as I mentioned in the back of the book, I probably spent more time in movie theaters than in the classroom. There were wonderful opportunities to get an education in film. I have no formal education in film, and I don't pretend to know, I'm not a film studies guy. I know a lot about 3 movies.
Well, those are 3 very good movies, so very big movies.
Yeah, and and there's some collateral things I had to learn along the way, a lot of things. But essentially, I'm just a journalist, and so what I don't know, I just try to find the people who do know something and talk to them about it and do the best I can. But I felt very lucky to have stumbled into this little subgenre. It's not just movies, and we can talk about this, of course. It's what movies reflect about the times they're made. They're great I think, great way of looking at the past and sort of summoning it all up. So I'm well equipped in some ways and incredibly ignorant in others.
Well, I've approached your work a little bit back to front. I started by reading your Midnight Cowboy book, which was amazing, and then I immediately thought, well, I've got to get the others, and then so I read the Searchers book and I read the High Noon book. Now, is that in the opposite order, or is it just mixed up, or?
It's totally opposite. Well, Searchers was the first one, and
right.
Searchers was when I left the Washington Post and I was lucky enough to land a gig at Sanford University teaching journalism. I had time, to do a book, but I didn't want to. I'd been a foreign correspondent, but I didn't want to write a book, I don't know, about the Iraq War or Tony Blair or whatever from California. I needed an American book. And Searchers had always fascinated me, and I talked about maybe doing that someday, coffee table book, I don't know, but it seemed like the obvious thing to come back to once I was at Stanford. I thought I could go out to Monument Valley and do a book about John Ford and John Wayne going to Monument Valley to make this amazing movie. I found out about a weekend, namely when I bought the 2-set DVD for the 50th anniversary, that it was the first documentary I, dialed up on that began with John Milius saying it's loosely based on the true story of Cynthia M. Parker. And so suddenly I was launched on a much more complicated and ambitious project, which would be to trace the damn thing from its real beginnings. But that's exactly what I was best suited to do, because, if it comes to writing about history or researching, I'm good. Writing about John Ford, who, was another matter. Writing about the movie where there was very little written down. But, I learned my way. I had a lot of help. So that's how I stumbled into the whole thing, and everything's just followed. And High Noon came second. I always loved High Noon, but I didn't think it was a great movie. But then I was at University of Texas. We did a little film series. I talked about Searchers. Somebody from Radio, TV, Film, who knows a lot about movies, did High Noon. And not only the Blacklist connection, but really, made the case for High Noon as a great movie. So I fell into my lap. And then Midnight Cowboy, as we might discuss, took much longer to come across, but boy, I'm very happy I did. I think in many ways it's the best of the three and the one that was most engaging for me. These books are wonderful for me because I get to learn stuff I don't know anything about.
That's a really good starting point, because you do you bring the reader along on a sort of journey with you as well.
Yeah, that's the idea anyway. And, some people know a hell of a lot more about all this stuff than I do, but I have my own distinct notion of how to make them. And having a movie is so helpful as a writer, because when things begin to slow down a little, you just toggle back to the movie and, everybody sits up and pays a little more attention. It's great to have movie stars in a book.
Yes. The first Searchers book, it's almost like, after the introduction, the movie doesn't turn up again for another sort of 200 pages.
Yes, which was a great disappointment to some of the readers. But I do begin it with John Ford. It's one, and sort of make a promise that we'll get back to this, reader. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the Comanche-Texan Wars. Yes, that some people thought that was great, and other people just hated the idea. But
I loved it. It reminded me of I don't know if there's some clip on YouTube of the sort of Who's That Line, or who's one of those black and white old quiz shows. And the person whose secret it is that the panel has to guess is that he was in the theater when Lincoln was shot. He was like, and just that sort of like, what? How can that person be on television if he was in the theater when Lincoln got? But that connectivity is exactly what the Searchers book does. It has that, frontier situation, and it draws a line which goes right up to the making of the film and then the reception thereafter, and right up to the present day, in fact.
Yeah, it was, the beauty of it was, I didn't know exactly what the theme of it was. For a while, I thought, I'm writing about storytellers, so everybody's a storyteller. Well, as things went along, it became clear to me what should have been obvious from first. It begins with a story that becomes a legend. It becomes a sort of frontier myth, that fits snuggles very well in the American myth. And each iteration, including Searchers, and in the end, including my own damn book, is another iteration of the myth, and examined, pulled apart, held up through the microscope of our own time and values and needs. And every generation reinvented that little girl's story to fit whoever was telling it. And so, I just, as I often do, I just kind of blundered into the theme, and it took a lot of work, but I was at Stanford and I had the time, and, it was incredible when I look back how many years it took to nail the thing down and how overly ambitious it was, but that's okay. I love doing it. And I think it's an unusual book, and that people don't write books like that about movies very much. So there you go.
In a way, it'd be interesting to see someone take that as a template and do it with a couple of other movies, because I'm sure there are films which would be well suited to that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Though it's a tough approach because you've got to be really interested in that. The folks who write movie books generally are interested in movies.
Yeah.
And they didn't, and a lot of them skip their, history courses in high school or college. Me, I didn't take any movie courses except one with the great Andrew Sarris rather late in the game, but I took all the history courses. I majored in history. So this is my own little, a lot of people could do this and do this well, but this happens to fit my own background and sensibility and, what I know and what I don't know. It works okay. It works for me.
How do you feel about, because I've had a very, I think probably a lot of people my generation would share this as well, a ambivalent relationship with John Wayne in that, I remember seeing him on TV and loving him and True Grit and all that sort of stuff. And then later in life, finding out about his politics and becoming a little bit more, ambivalent, if not hostile. And then sort of as I've gone older, I've actually got back into him and really appreciate him. I read the Scott Eyman biography and I really appreciate him more. How has your sort of relationship with the Duke progressed? Well,
I think it's a similar arc in the sense that I loved, the early stuff I saw. I was too young to read much into it. Some of the movies like Searchers are very deep and complicated. Others are not at all. I think for all of us of a certain age, Wayne became this right-wing archetypal figure, very one-dimensional, John Birch Society supporter. And his films, after people like John Ford and Howard Hawks fade away, because Wayne's younger than them and his career continues, he takes over really making his own films, and they become very one-dimensional and becomes a bit of a parody of himself. The toupee, the weight he gains over the years, he's not working with great people, with great directors anymore. He's directing himself, basically. So, and it's only later when I went back and saw some of the early Wayne, and I did take a course in John Wayne at Stanford. I sat in on a graduate film course, and that you see the younger Wayne and how lithe and how alive his performances are, and you learn more about his story. That doesn't change the toxicity of his politics and his racial, prejudices and all that. But at the same time, you see what a talented performer he was, and you get to appreciate that. And Searchers, of course, is, in my mind, his greatest performance, and in his most complex movie. He's not responsible for the complexity of the movie, but he is responsible for the performance. And without his performance, without taking that iconic Indian killer figure and showing us what's underneath that and all the damage. This is a guy who sets out to kill his niece because she slept with Comanches after being kidnapped. But he never says, oh, I've got perfect solution for my problem. I'll just go kill my niece and everything will be fine. You can tell he's deeply troubled by all that he doesn't have an answer, that, taking out a gun and shooting somebody ain't going to get anybody any peace out of this. And it's a masterful performance. And once you begin to get comfortable with that, well, inevitably you have to have more respect, at least for the guy who does it. And he understood that Searchers was complicated. He knew what he was doing. It's a brilliant performance. And so just like I have to give Jon Voight credit for his brilliant performances, despite his incredibly contemporary toxic politics, you have to respect the actor and the role.
also Ford is such a strange mixture of like there's elements of sort of really down to earth, I mean, I was thinking about it as I was reading your book, and I came up with the phrase folksy fascism, because there's a sort of like, yeah, everybody should get on, and there's a down to earth quality and all the rest of it, but Ward Bond and people like that are gonna always be there, to kill people in case.
Well, welcome to my country. I'm sure you've noticed, I don't know how much time you've spent in the States over the years, but, just like the UK is a pretty complex place these days and always has been, and this sort of irrational right wing back to the land, Little England, all that, we've got our own version of all that and more. I remember I spent 6 years as the Washington Post bureau chief in the UK on 2 separate occasions, and I remember, especially with Chris Patton, one of your more enlightened conservatives, it was Chris just making fun of the evangelical movement, things that people couldn't understand in the UK. And yet, of course, every country, including the Netherlands, including all these so-called enlightened places, have their versions of this. But in the United States, it's more out there. And there's no question John Ford was an enormously complex, difficult person. Even his sexuality is complex and difficult to sort through. That's the country we live in.
It's one of those, what did Freud say? The sort of return of the repressed, that he has this sort of like clenched masculinity, which doesn't admit its sort of homoeroticism, and yet there it is for all to see.
I wish it were more repressed, but that's okay.
And then, of course, you have like when it comes to so I'll take them in the order of publication then, rather than the order I read them in. But then you have that sort of right-wing politics bleeding into the sort of appreciation of the film these days as well. And I think, I mean, in terms of I've heard a podcast recently that really kind of dismissed The Searchers out of hand as this is just sort of white supremacy bullshit, and we're not taking that. I'm not comfortable with that dismissal. I think there's so much more, as you say. I think it's complicated, and it needs to be seen.
No, I agree with you. I mean, look, it's a racist movie, and I would never defend it as not being a racist movie, for heaven's sakes. And I'm not defending John Ford's paternalistic at best treatment of Native Americans. And in this movie, it's not very paternalistic. It's much more straight ahead. But it's a racist movie about racism. And yeah, it's a white male fantasy too, except for the fact that it's hard not to notice that it's the women and it's their active agent, Martin, who happens to be a man, but also happens to be to have Cherokee blood. 1/8, I believe, only is what they give him. But nonetheless, in the book, incidentally, the Martin character is strictly white, has no Native American blood. But here we have, ultimately, I read it as the triumph of the women and Martin and family over violence. The violent men are either dead at the end of the movie or they are excluded from the community, from the home. Now, I don't want to defend anything here. I think in all of its complexity and, psychosis and ambiguity, Searchers reflects very well the time it was made in and the time we exist in now. And it's jagged edges and it's, bloody background and it's, all of that is important to capture and to chew over. And every generation will have to make its own decisions about Searchers. And I just would urge people to watch it and watch it more than once, because I don't think there's a better or more complicated movie about America, about our frontier origins, about our ongoing racial dilemmas, about our gender politics, you name it. It's all sitting in there, and like it or not, it's served up right in front of us.
Whenever I think of the film, I think of 2 shots. Of course, the famous one of John Wayne sort of walking away and the door closing as he leaves, and the one where he is in the with the rescued women who, they're no longer white sort of statement, and the camera pushing in on him looking back to them. I think those seem to be images that just burn through the film with this sort of this ambivalence, this the look on his face is not one of it's one of defeat, of utter well, I don't know, what do you think?
Yes, I think defeat is a good word. We've now moved to some territory that has no map for him. Up to now, he knew what he was doing. He knew how he was setting forth. He was coming around quick to the idea that he just, take care of Debbie when the time came, namely killed her. But he's so unsettled. He's so unmoored. And as the movie goes on, he becomes more unmoored, more unsettled by this, whereas Martin becomes more certain of what the mission really has to be, and that's rescuing his damn sister and getting her home again. So this kind of tension, and he comes to respect Martin. This is another part of the complexity. He thinks Martin's a callow kid at first, and he makes fun of him constantly and derides him in racist terms. By the end of the movie, he's acceding to Martin and letting him call the shots in many ways because he doesn't know what to do. And so it's these complexities that really make for such a rich, that help make Searchers a very rich, complicated movie. I should add, John Ford, as he got older, became more complicated, and he still serves up in Searchers all of the iconic Western, tropes, the savage, Native Americans, the man who knows Indians, the Indian killer who protects us with a gun, but who knows Indian lore, and all those things that come from James Fenimore Cooper and earlier manifestations. They're all in there, and yet therefore Ford is also undermining all of these iconic figures and tropes. He's also suggesting that things are a lot more complicated and unhappy and sad and fragile than one might expect. And so, I don't expect everybody to get it or even to try to get it. If someone critiques the movie as a racist thing that doesn't need to be watched anymore, well, that's their privilege. Movies are very personal. They're very intimate in a way. Our connection to them depends a lot on who we are and when we watch the movie. When I watch a movie like Searchers when I'm 12 years old, it's very different than I'm watching it in my 70s. So that's fine. I mean, but we miss a very rich experience, I think, if we just put that movie, lock that movie in a closet and forget about it. It's too powerful and it's too painful to be left in a closet.
I think as well, when we have an understanding of history, we see a value in historical things which involve their difference from our contemporary reality as well. But these things don't fit comfortably within the framework of how we're comfortable with talking about things because they happened half a century ago or more.
They're not supposed to fit comfortably. History never fits comfortably. And if we think we can put everything in a neat little box, and it's racist, not racist, all of that. I mean, we've been going through this again, and history constantly recycles itself. And in this country where our vision of who we are, of what it means to be an American, things we thought were settled, at least after the American Civil War, turns out they're never settled, that they need to be revisited and argued about. And sometimes guns go off for each generation. And my God, that's what we're seeing now in the United States, especially, is another reckoning with who we are and who gets to be an American and who doesn't, who's allowed here and who isn't allowed here, what it means to be an American. These questions, it turns out, are never settled. And smug people like me who thought, after Britain voted, I remember the referendum that, passed Brexit. It was the summer of 2016, and I was in London researching the High Noon book. And I said to friends, well, nice going. You've been criticizing America all these years, and now, your idiot country is about to slit its own throat economically for no reason at all. I said, and at least, whatever's going on with you guys, at least we won't elect an idiot like Donald Trump president. And of course, 3 months later, that's exactly what we did. So don't listen to me. I don't know anything.
I had the twofer. I was convinced Brexit wouldn't happen. I was convinced Donald Trump wouldn't be elected, and I was strident in my political prognosis and how wrong I was.
Yeah, well, my wife likes to remind me of things like that, so I've stopped making predictions. But I'm happy to talk about the past.
Retrospectively, I have a better idea. And going into the second book then. Talking about being really uncomfortable, one of the things that struck me, I know about HUAC, and I not very in depth, and your book was probably as in depth as I'd been in up until now, and it just struck me as what a horrible and depressing time that was, just in the sense that not only because of the naming of names, the bullying, the cowardice, all of that thing, but even the sort of thing that was being defended, membership of the Communist Party, wasn't that great a thing either. I mean, the Communist Party was, at that point were, proto-fascist, well, not proto-fascistic, but they were totalitarian, let's say. And yeah, it's just like there are no goodies at all in that story, really. I mean, a few victims, definitely, but very few proper, unambiguous heroes.
Well, there were some brave people, but, I'm not as interested in brave people as I am in people who just have to muddle through. That's why I loved writing about Carl Foreman, the screenwriter of High Noon, the associate producer of High Noon, the man who was called to testify in the middle of the film shoot. Carl wants to find a way to get out of this problem. He's been nominated for Academy Awards for Best Screenplay Writer. His career is just taking off. He doesn't want to be a martyr. He squirms and tries to find a legalistic way to avoid betraying his friendship and his deepest principles, and yet at the same time cooperate with these clowns and get this off his plate and get on to his golden career. But he can't do it. In that sense, he's like the Marshal in High Noon, and of course he ends up identifying with him. The Gary Cooper character, doesn't want to face 4 young gunmen alone on the street. He tries every way to get out of it. He tries to get all his pals to help him, but of course they walk away from him. He's on his own. He'd much rather ride off with Grace Kelly somewhere, his new bride, but he can't do it. And it's this sort of reluctant courage under fire, this the last straw, the last thing, and you can't get out of it. That's in some ways, to me, a very American thing. And it's one of the reasons why High Noon is still worth watching. And there are people like that. There are people who tried during the Blacklist era. The thing that struck me was so obvious. All these institutions that are designed to protect us in these moments failed. Every one of them. The Democratic Party was useless. The White House, where both President Truman and later President Eisenhower didn't like the committee, didn't like what it was doing. They were useless for the longest time. The courts didn't defend anyone. Even the institutions like the Jewish community, the very liberal Jewish community in Hollywood and the ACLU, they just, they rolled over for the most part. Nothing was there to protect us. And in that sense, it's an interesting parallel between them and now, because we face, this time institutions held up a little better in the Trump era. The Democratic Party, for example, hung in there. The media did a much better job this time around. But nonetheless, he got elected president, and it was a very close call as to us plunging into a terrible era. And we're not out of the woods yet.
Oh, no.
So I had no idea when I started on that book that I'd be writing about something with so much contemporary resonance. And I'm very sorry that it has so much. But we go through these cycles of, backlash. Here it comes after World War II and after the New Deal, the most progressive moments in American history, I would argue. And then, boom, we get dragged back into the morass.
Absolutely. I love the bit in the movie which connects so much to this and this idea of sort of heroism as a sort of compromised, dirty thing is him riding out with Grace Kelly in their little buggy, and they go out and he gets halfway and he actually has this line which I thought was amazing, where he says, "What am I doing out here? I don't even have a gun."
Yeah.
And it's just like, so him going back is I can't run away, but it's also, this is suicide. If these guys are going to follow me, they're going to gun me down. And so there's this, even at that point, the decision is a mixture of him, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, and I haven't got a gun. I should go back and get a gun.
Yeah, that's a very good point. He's a very clear thinker. He doesn't like the results of what he's finding out. And you can look at the whole film as his journey, of course, around town, looking to find a different meaning. But the meaning becomes clear to him, especially in that church scene in the middle, that public scene where, having been abandoned by the state, he's now abandoned by God and God's supposed followers. He sees it. And yeah, he sees they'll be mowed down if they're out there in open territory with no gun. He's got to have a gun. He still thinks he can get the folks to back him up. He's in for a big surprise. And in the end, though, he has to walk out and face those 4 guys. He could have taken his guns, grabbed the girl, and, and hightailed it out and maybe gotten away, maybe not. Who knows? It's a Western, he could shoot them all from distance somewhere. But he can't do it. He can't do it. He can't explain it. He's so, you have to listen to the song. It's too bad the bride couldn't hear the song, because that explains very well. She keeps just asking, why are you doing this? And he can't tell her. He can't explain it. The song explains it. But it's just a very rich, and it's so beautifully put together, the screenplay, using the clock, using all that. It's wound, it's a clock itself. It's a beautifully timed mechanism. It's very artful, and for all kinds of reasons. But the heart of it still is this guy who, you're right, he's being pragmatic, but he's coming to the obvious conclusions. But in the end, he still walks out there on the street, and she saves him. She saves, and that's beautiful too. That's the most romantic, one of the most romantic things I've ever seen in a movie, her shooting that guy.
And she has to sort of twist her principles as well in order to do that, because of course she's a Quaker, so she's a pacifist. And so, they have to sort of meet in the middle somehow. Exactly.
She has to betray her deepest beliefs, and they're based on what she had seen in her life earlier, the gunning down of her father and her brother. So, these are 2 people who have only themselves to rely upon in the end. And they come through for each other. That's the sort of romantic part of this movie. In real life, the 4 guys would have gunned him down and kicked his body into the dirt and rode off with her to God knows what would happen after that. But this being a movie, it ends in this other way. But still, Carl, this movie packs a real punch because...
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
He leaves this corrupt community. And, John Wayne wasn't totally wrong. He hated this movie. He thought it was a commie movie. It's not a commie movie, but it has a very, very dark view of bourgeois society. And it's cowardice when faced with a real challenge.
It's so funny as well that John Wayne, accepting the Oscar for Gary Cooper, made that sort of mealy-mouthed speech about, oh, why don't I get parts like this? And it's like behind the scenes, he's trying to get them to burn the negative.
Right. Well, John Wayne was a great believer in hierarchy, though, and Gary Cooper was his elder and someone he had admired and still admired. And so he, like your liege, he stooped down, and went and did his job. There's more than a little hypocrisy in Hollywood, John. I know this will shock you to hear that.
I'm sitting down. I'm glad I'm sitting down when you say that. I mean, Cooper's such an amazing, because I've watched him in the 30s, and he does the sort of champagne movies and the Lubitsch comedies, and he goes all the way Sergeant York and all the way through to the westerns. And he seems much more. You have this part in the book where you talk about, Cooper. Gary Cooper can't die, so that's one thing he won't do at the end of the movie, and how he has this limited range. But with that limited range, he does a whole sweep of genres.
Yeah, he could do anything, really. He was very careful about his image and all that. And one of the things that struck me, you're right. He's a very talented comic performer and other things. Yet it was hard not to notice in the 50s, when his career is in decline and his health is declining, he's very negative about his own performances and about his career. He feels like he's betrayed something, that he's never been really real. It's a sad thing, because he was incredibly talented and he really set a benchmark for other actors. Tom Hanks wrote an introduction to one of the books that Cooper's daughter, a coffee table book, and talked about how influential Cooper's acting was for people like him. He's a great movie actor, and he's always convincing. He's in a lot of terrible movies, but he's always good. And in High Noon, I mean, it's an extraordinary performance in that it's so minimalistic and naturalistic, and and almost could be a silent film for all he has to say there. And yet it's very convincing and very powerful. It is a tribute to him and to the magic that movies can pull, the magic wand that movies can wave over a story.
I've become, I think since the lockdown, I've really sort of gone through a whole bunch of his films and just discovered totally different angles, probably from knowing him from High Noon and then back. But you said right at the beginning that you sort of, you didn't, High Noon wasn't a film that you particularly liked when, and then you sort of did a course and look, or you saw it again and sort of saw it in a new lens. Did you? Is there, through the writing of the books, is there a new way that you look at the movies? Then was there something particular that sort of struck you?
Well, the thing about, when you watch a movie, when you first see a movie, of course, you've seen it, but then, a good movie deserves to be watched again. And the process of doing a book sort of requires you to watch a movie many, many times.
Sure.
I remember seeing Searchers with Joe McBride, one of the great biographers of John Ford, and Joe very generously with his time, walked me through the movie, and I saw things I'd never seen before and ways of thinking about things. I think good movies, of course, always reward reviewing. Midnight Cowboy has been like that too. And again, this is partly having watched it when I was 19, and then again, maybe in my 40s, and then again, and now having watched it many times. Midnight Cowboy in many ways really rewards watching over and over again, in part because the original story is so bleak, it can often blind you to what's going on in the movie, other than the bleakness as winter sets in and these poor guys, are in desperate situations. Well, after you've seen the bleakness, you still know it's there, but you begin to notice all the other things, the comedy in Midnight Cowboy, the beauty of the small performances of Jon Voight and his little playlets with the other actors. He's in every scene, but it's a two-hander almost constantly, first with Sylvia Miles and then, with John MacGyver, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're also wonderful. And many of them are funny, so, sharp, nasty at times. You begin to pick up, it's a complex movie in a way, visually complex, and in ways that either High Noon or Searchers are. So it really rewarded continual viewing and watching. Also, it's part of the job to fall in love with these films. But I find in each case, that I have. I mean, I used to put Midnight Cowboy down somewhere below Godfather and The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde and the great new Hollywood movies. I used to keep it about number 10. Well, it's number 1 as far as I'm concerned. It's more complex and has more things to say and is more successful and modern. I love those other movies. I mean, the Godfather movies I could watch all day. But, Midnight Cowboy really is a very rich cinematic experience. So, yeah, helps to watch them again and again. I
watched it when I was like 18, 19. When you're discovering all those 70s movies and you're going through the new Hollywood, and I was, you'd read about a film and think, right, I've got to see this. This is one that keeps coming up again and again. But The Graduate, The Godfather, I've rewatched hundreds of times. I rewatched Midnight Cowboy, I think, for what must be either the second or third, or probably even probably just the second time on Sunday, because I'd read your book and I thought I'm going to dig it out and rewatch it. And I was knocked down by how it stood up and how fresh it felt. It had that weird double thing of feeling at once totally of its time and yet totally fresh and new and daring,
That's a very good point. There's a duality to it because it captures New York in the late 60s brilliantly in terms of attitude and the cinematography. It is like a documentary. And no surprise, John Schlesinger and his cinematographer, Adam Hollander, both come from documentary backgrounds. They're both loved in, Italian neorealism movies of the late 40s and 50s. They share that sensibility. I lived in New York in those years. I went to Columbia University, and New York looked like that and smell. You can even smell New York in that movie. Yet at the same time, it has a very modern feel to it. And I think part of that is the wonderful acting, both the two leads who are extraordinary, Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, but everybody in that movie is great. I just saw it 2 weeks ago in Austin, Texas on a big screen. I hadn't seen it on a big screen, I don't think, since I first saw it. And that was a powerful experience. And it was interesting. My wife, who has never loved Midnight Cowboy and was kind of, dreading having to see it many times, she was rescued in part by the pandemic, which meant we didn't go out and go around the country showing the movie and talking about the book the way we usually do. But she saw it on the big screen and she liked it much better then. You could see some of the things just stick out at you, especially the close-ups. Schlesinger doesn't do a lot of close-ups, but when he does one, you're there. And, especially with Voight and Hoffman in the shabby tenement, squat that they're in, those close-ups are just very powerful on a big screen. So it really is a movie that unfolds and that always gives you something. The screenplay, you appreciate more and more the tightness of the screenplay, the brilliance of the first third of the movie, which is a combination, I think, of all these things, plus the damn song.
Yes.
I mean, that song, everybody likes to credit Mike Nichols, and he deserves credit for having invented almost the modern soundtrack of using Simon and Garfunkel over and over again. Sound of Silence 3 times, I think, in the first 30 minutes of The Graduate. But boy, Schlesinger uses Everybody's Talking more effectively in a way. It really is the heart of what he's trying to do, because it's the heart of the character. Everything in that movie in the end is from Jon Voight, from Joe Buck's point of view.
Right.
And that song just beautifully sums it up. And also it's just such a beautiful song, the way it's done. So, it's the full package as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Jon Voight's performance, as you say, he's become something of a caricature in recent years in terms of certainly his public persona. I believe he's still a great actor, but his Joe Buck is such. I mean, the way he holds onto that transistor radio and he's constantly playing with it. And at first you think that's a bit sort of hokey, and I'm not sure what he's doing with that and what's the idea. And then you realize that this guy is like a traumatized, and it's his security blanket. It's his way of sort of putting something between him and the world. It's just amazing. And
that's a very good point. It really is the thing he clings to. And it's a very sad moment and symbolic moment when he finally lets go of it for $5. You're too young to remember when transistor radios were like the coolest thing in the world.
I'm not that young, unfortunately.
Well, maybe you had one under your pillow every night, hiding from your parents, listening to, rock and roll at 11 on weekends and midnight, with that damn little transistor radio that didn't work so well, and that stupid little, you had an earphone that came with it that never worked properly.
And occasionally the station would go out and you'd have to redial.
Yeah, what a mess. But those things were, he's partly a case of arrested development. He's trapped in an adolescence, if you will. He's a man trapped in a kid's sensibility, and the transistor radio is really crucial to that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and Hoffman as well, coming off The Graduate. I mean, they'd already cast him before The Graduate hit big, of course, but what a decision to do that as a sort of his sort of follow-up movie, and Mike Nichols being furious at him because it was like, I made you a star and you're going to play this sort of Beckett character.
Yeah. Well, Hoffman is, Hoffman's such a fascinating figure because, as you point out, he comes off The Graduate and he's not just suddenly a movie star, which he never expected to be and claims he didn't really want to be, but he's a movie star in Mike Nichols's movie where Nichols is shaping his performance and making him do things that he's not comfortable with. And then he's also a counterculture icon immediately, because The Graduate in the end is a generation gap movie. And we all watched it and said, yeah, we hate our parents too, because we did. That came with the territory. Hopefully you grow out of it. Some people never did. So Hoffman is suddenly this big deal. And for him to get in this kind of movie, really, it affirmed for us that Hoffman was very special, that he wasn't, just the average guy looking for a break, that he had a meaning to his life. And the meaning of his life was to be a great actor, and that not a great movie star. Now, was he conflicted about that? Yes, of course, because he wanted the money and he wanted the success. But at the same time, he wanted to be true to his identity, to his values. And so you watch Hoffman wrestle with this, and he makes this movie. And I think one of the reasons this movie did so well, yes, he's great in it. It's one of the reasons it's a great movie. But one of the reasons the movie made a lot of money was because Hoffman was in it. I mean, I went to see the movie in part because there was Dustin Hoffman, and this looked really interesting. And it affirmed our belief in Dustin Hoffman, and it made him an even bigger movie star.
Yeah, he wasn't just going to go and do a sort of graduate version to, not necessarily a sequel, but just that character in some other situation.
I don't know if he was kidding me or not, but he said they offered him The Graduate Goes Out West at one point, that kind of thing. I mean, I think he was making that up a little, but everybody wanted to do the same damn movie again. Of course, there's no way you can make another version of The Graduate. It's sui generis, to say the least. Hoffman had a great career in part because he was willing to do the things that he believed in and not anything else.
Yeah, I mean, well, one after the other. You could argue that The Graduate is, as you say, sui generis, and then Midnight Cowboy. It's not like there's another Midnight Cowboy that comes along in a few years. Or, I mean, it's kind of it's hard to even think of today there being similar, films about sort of male friendship, which is so complex and so complicated in terms of homophobia, homoeroticism, and the life of a male prostitute.
Yeah, no, it is very much its own movie. It's very much John Schlesinger's movie, his take on it. One of the things that's so extraordinary about the story, of course, is we sympathize with Joe Buck. We want him, we laugh at him, but we ache for him also. And then he goes out and he almost kills, or maybe does kill, his pathetic male customer near the end of the movie. And that was in the book. And Schlesinger insisted on keeping it in the screenplay. Waldo Salt agreed with him. I mean, it was a tough call, but it's one of the things that I think is part of what makes it a great movie is that it's it doesn't compromise. Schlesinger wanted to make a movie that people would go see and enjoy and spend money on and all that, but he also wanted to make the damn movie that he wanted to make and be true to his vision of what it had to be. And you see it there, and Voight does it. I mean, Voight it's still Joe Buck. We still sympathize with him, but there he is beating up this poor schnook. So nothing's easy for you in Midnight Cowboy. Nothing's handed to you and said, "Oh, feel good about this."
Yeah, and I mean, what you said earlier about the Waldo Salt screenplay as well, because right at the very beginning, Dustin Hoffman refers to him as killer, and then you have that scene at the end, and there's another little moment in the screenplay that I love, which is John Voight gets Rizzo's name correct. And at that point, you just know, oh God, he's dead, isn't he? He's dead. There's no way he got that. That's like that's the Chekhovian moment of like, here comes tragedy,
Yeah, fair enough.
You mentioned earlier that the first hour of the movie is the series of sort of playlets that John Voight does with these different situations and what have you. When you get to the sort of you wouldn't even call it a cold water flat. It's almost like the film sort of becomes like a Beckett play or something, a really sort of down market Pinter. It's.
Well, yes. I mean, that's, having been out in big New York with all these predators, now we've worked our way into sort of subterranean New York with, one predator, it turns out not to be such a predator. So they're on their own now, but they're still up against the elements because it's a squat. Right. It's the water, surprisingly, there is running water. I'm not sure how that worked. There was no electricity and things get desperate. And it's like, once you get to the bottom, there's still more bottom to go. And they finally, they have to get out. They can't stay there. For one thing, the demolition guys are catching up to them slowly and going to knock this place down. But for another, it's getting colder and nastier. So you're right. It's very, subterranean, and then it gets more subterranean. And they're desperate men.
There's so much serendipity making these movies, especially, retrospectively, you look back and you think, oh, well, it couldn't be any other way. But, one of the things that struck me in the book as well was the idea that for the party scene, Andy Warhol was supposed to be going. And I think that would have, I don't think that would have worked. I'm not saying I'm glad Andy Warhol got shot and wasn't able to go, because that would be too much of a sacrifice to the movie gods. But it would have. I think there would have been an element of imbalance to them sort of meeting someone so recognizable or having him on the screen.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I in the end, Warhol wasn't willing to do it because he couldn't control it. And I think one of the things he might have recognized is that he would have been cut to like 5 seconds. They would have just shown his face just to ground us a little more. I keep coming and going about the party scene. On some level, I don't think it really works very well, but it does open up the movie in terms of what New York was like in that era, and that you could be in a situation with these crazy lunatic, superstars and homeless people being at the same party. New York, the cultural scene was kind of wide open and weird and dangerous and all that. It moves the plot along in a number of different ways. So, I'm coming around to it, but boy, it took them 5 or 6 days to film it, and they use about 7 minutes altogether. And a lot of people, it's just hard to say whether it really works or not, but it had to be there. I mean, they had to make those moves. And the energy that went into putting this together, getting all these people dressed, getting all these superstars and, Warhol's second-rate recruits down there and filming them day after day and allowing them to smoke dope and screw in the hallways and all that. What an enterprise. I mean, that sums up the time in a way that the effort to make the scene is especially more about the 60s than the scene itself.
There's a real sense as well that there's a new era coming in, and in some ways maybe Joe and Rizzo are just not, they're in the wrong time. You get a feeling that Rizzo would have been, he would have been with the Beats or something in the 50s rather than the late 60s. A conniver like him could have got away easier.
Yeah, maybe so. And it's interesting because the novel, of course, by James Leo Herlihy was set in the early 60s and published in 65. And the party there is more of a beatnik style party, a couple of hip guys dancing together and bongo drums and things like that. So I think you see a little bit of that disconnect between that era and the late 60s, when suddenly all the borders are gone and everybody's going crazy in a whole new, both exciting and scary way.
I love the way as well in all of the books there's this sort of afterlife to the movie and to there's a because each of these movies has such important sort of endings. They're so you have the searchers with the closing door, and Natalie Wood, what happens to her? And then when you read about the legend and you find out what actually happened to the woman, it kind of puts on another layer of tragedy to the end of the movie. And the same thing with sort of Midnight Cowboy and even the author's life in the 60s, where he sort of becomes a little bit of a, I don't know, kind of tourist in the hippie area, that he's sort of going around to different communities and just hanging out with people, using the money he got from Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah, Jim Herlihy was a complicated, interesting figure. I mean, one of the things I set out to do was, and I've done it in some of the other books as well, is find people who we don't know much about, but who were so important to these stories. And Jim, I was hoping Jim would show me all around New York in the 50s and 60s. And he didn't leave any journals or anything to do that, but he himself, wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be a writer. He a playwright, an actor, lives this life and tries to get through it. Complicated, unhappy guy in some ways, but very charming. And he the hippie movement sets him off, gets him very excited. This notion of love, and he's ready for that. He has his ups and downs. He's suffering. He self-diagnoses himself as manic depressive, and so his life is a constant, roller coaster. And the hippies really appealed to him on some naive level, but also his deepest need for some kind of fulfillment in life. And writing gets to be so hard for him that no longer provides it for him. For a while, the hippie movement does, but Jim always has to leave. he can't stay anywhere. He gets to New York. He's very excited by it. Eventually, he can't handle it anymore. He moves to Key West, loves it for a while. Then it becomes too much. Ends up in Hollywood, where he's a little older and a little quieter. And that's where he lives his life until he died. He contracts AIDS in the early 90s and commits suicide in 93. It's something he'd always been rehearsing in a funny way in his life, his exit from it, and he finally takes it. I thought he was a very sad figure, very complicated person. I can't pretend I really got to the heart of him, but I loved tracking him down, and I love the many places he went. And this story, which really is the only thing we'll ever, if we remember James Leo Herlihy, it'll be for Midnight Cowboy. And it's a very good book, and it really does capture in its complexity, especially of these characters, a humanity that it was at the heart of Herlihy's life.
Yeah, I think all the books have this almost as a theme of bringing out like where stories come from and where they go, and they have a much longer life than just the 90 minutes or the 2 hours that you see on the screen.
It'll be interesting to see what happens to Joe Buck after, he gets off the bus. We don't know. He's had some redemption here and there, and some recognition that he needs to be a vulnerable, normal human being if he's ever going to connect with other people. But he's almost just killed a man, and his partner, the person who is going to help him guide him in this, has just died on the bus. And he looks like he has no idea what's coming next. And we don't know. He could get off at the bus station and buy a ticket back to New York, or he could settle down in Florida where he might be a normal guy, or he might become a real estate broker. I mean, we don't, nothing's clear. And one of my people who've written into me suggested, wow, what about a sequel about what happens to Joe Buck? And I had to point out to him that I actually don't write novels. But also, I don't know what that novel would, what we would do with Joe. So it's a very ambiguous and I think very appropriate end to that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a hint in him sort of throwing his clothes and his cowboy boots away that some sort of transformation has taken place. But yeah, it's totally open what that transformation will be into.
And whether he can survive the transition to reality, if you will. He's basically saying, okay, the masquerade's over. I'm not a cowboy. I know that. I'm not a hustler. I know that. But what are you, Joe? What are you? You're going to date that nice young girl who served you coffee? Are you going to settle down and, get a job and, form a bowling league? I mean, who are you? And how are you going to survive all the things you've been through? We don't know.
That rhymes a little bit with. I always loved. I think you quoted in the book John Wayne's take on the ending of The Searchers, where he says, "I don't believe he sort of has to go. I think he just goes to the next town, has a few drinks, and comes back." He doesn't. Why does he have to? A door closes doesn't mean he never can go back inside the house.
Yeah, well, John wasn't that big on. And cinematic symbolism, but I mean, then again, he goes out and makes, the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is the same theme. He plays a character who also can't step into the modern world, who helps create the conditions for modern civilization, and I put civilization in quotes, but he can't be part of it. A man of violence, he's a man of simple ideas, and he can't be thrust in this more complex world, and he doesn't survive. So you can he should look forward and watch The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance to know what his fate really is.
Listen, Glenn, I've got one last question for you. You've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. But I always have to ask everybody for a film book recommendation. So what's your film book recommendation?
That's a tough one for me because I've really been immersed in so many and I love so many of them. But my personal favorite has to be, I would say, Pictures in a Revolution, at a Revolution, excuse me, The Movies and the Birth of the New Hollywood by Mark Harris. It's about 1967, and Mark takes the 5 Academy Award nominees for Best Picture that year, which range all the way from Dr. Dolittle on the old-fashioned studio, lumbering mammoth, all the way to The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde. And he dissects each one of them, uses the making of the movie. I do one movie, Mark did 5. He writes beautifully. He gets the context. He's just so knowledgeable. He's my model. He's like 15 years younger than me. And, but he's been doing this all his life. He worked at Entertainment Weekly. it's a beautifully done book, and it tells you so much about that pivotal era, when the studio system is undergoing massive change, and that sort of brief golden moment when American movies, set out and did some things. So that's the one I keep leaning back and wishing I could have done half as well as Mark.
Well, I would respectfully disagree in the sense that I think that it's very comparable. It's an excellent book, Pictures from the Revolution, and it sits on my shelf alongside your books now. And we had Mark on the podcast a couple of months ago, and he was talking about Mike Nichols, but we also talked about Pictures from the Revolution. So that's a brilliant recommended book. Thank you so much, Glenn, for your time, and thank you so much for talking to me. And congratulations on these wonderful books. It's so great to have a really fresh way of looking at films. I love my history, so it's good to see them in their context.
Well, John, this was fun. I mean, you know a lot more about movies than I do, and it was really fun to go over these again, the three of them. I mean, that's a rare treat for me too.
So that was my conversation with Glenn. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I found it's a fascinating mind and a brilliant writer. His recommended book was Mark Harris's Pictures from the Revolution, also called Scenes from the Revolution, the UK edition. If you haven't read it already, I add my voice to Glenn's unnecessarily. You can also listen to Mark talk about that in an earlier podcast, in an earlier episode on Writers on Film. Just go to the webpage and download. All that remains for me to do is to thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Howard, who helps out with the art, and until the next conversation, please take care.
As the days get shorter and the nights chillier, it's tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings workouts and wellness to the comfort of your home. Join alomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to sound baths and meditations, Alo Moves has it all, with classes made to fit every schedule. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with code ACAST at alomoves.com.
1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.